Well, good afternoon or possibly even good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I can't be here in person, but I'm afraid I have to be elsewhere. So we concluded that virtual presence is better than no presence. And I'd like to say, pleasure for me always to be addressing people at the College of Europe. I spent a very agreeable year here. Oh, really, it was in the ice period, and it really was the literal ice period because it was miserably cold that winter, the winter of 62, 63. So I hope you're enjoying the year as much as I did at the time. Things have moved on. At that time, of course, we were all committed Europeans, even if in the middle of my year, President de Gaulle issued his veto on British membership, but still. Being a part of Europe was, I think, seen as the right thing to be. I don't use this expression, the right side of history. I think it's a piece of nonsense. History doesn't have sides, but in a sense, I think we all felt that what we were doing, studying at the college, was pointing towards a particular future of which we all approved. However, things have moved on in the last, well, half century and more. And in a way, this is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about how things moved in one part of Europe and then how things moved in the other part of Europe. And you will recall, please don't listen to my accent, I am Hungarian, and it's Hungary that I represent in the European Parliament and have done for 12 and a half years. So basically, the question that I like to raise, it's a rhetorical question to which I will provide an answer, is why integrate? What's the point of integrating? Now, the simple answer is, oh, well, you know, it's for peace and democracy and prosperity. So then, well, okay, fine, but how? And here it seems to me is we get closer to the answer because in 1945, and I'm just old enough to remember that, Europe was in ruins, physically in ruins. Anybody who wants to look at it, find photographs of Budapest. Today I know it's very cool. In 1944-45, after the siege, it was a heap of smoking ruins. And I have my own memories of that. Now, if you enlarge that to the whole of Europe, there are obviously the neutrals who are outside this, but you have a Europe which is traumatized by the destruction of human beings, incidentally, not just of buildings, but above all, I think, in people's thinking, well, how could we have got here? What was it that we did wrong that within one generation, Europe should be involved in 2 world wars? And bear in mind, the people taking political decisions in 1945 were very much alive during the First World War. Obviously, I wasn't. And here I think we get closer to the answer. Yes, of course, it's to prevent more war, and indeed, above all, preventing any further wars between France and Germany, in which respect it's been brilliantly successful, 100% success. But if you think about the trauma that Europe was in, then the integration process is a way to lead Europe out of that trauma, to allow Europe to recover its own sense of being, that it's actually worthwhile to live on and not to find oneself in a state of total depression, I mean collective as well as individual depression. And here I think we have something very interesting, a piece of highly original, innovative thinking. How do we ensure that the terrible conflict which engulfed Europe in 1914 and again in 1939 is never repeated? And I think we then have to look at, well, what are the sources of this conflict and what are the means of conflict resolution? Well, in my analysis, the particularity, the European uniqueness, if you like, of Europe is that Europe is the site of about 35 high cultures. And each high culture, if it possibly can, constructs power institutions, which means state institutions, to ensure that that culture is protected. And above all, and I think all cultures do this, whether we're talking of a small institution, whether a trade union, an NGO, or whether we're talking about a major cultural collectivity, its basic purpose, its basic rationality is to ensure its own cultural reproduction. Now, once you have not necessarily 35 states, but a very large number of states, how do you ensure that conflict between them is resolved? Question number one. And the second vital element of Europe is that the state powers, the state capacity, the ability of the state to do what it wants to, is asymmetrical. There are very large states, very powerful states, and of course also quite substantial number of small states in Europe. Indeed, I go so far as to argue that the small to medium-sized state is the European norm, but basically, not entirely, but very largely, it's the large states that determine the agenda. So it's to resolve these particular problems, the trauma, the asymmetry, the conflict, and finding a way for these various different cultures to live together, that the European integration process provided the answer. And the answer, and this is I think the original, the near genius step, is to say that there are methods of conflict resolution. You don't have to suppress them violently or otherwise, structural violence, physical violence, but you can find ways of compromising them. You can find forms of consensus building by giving everybody something, power sharing or whatever. This is the methods of democracy. And as I'm suggesting, the genius was to find a way of bringing this to the international level. In Europe, in any case, not necessarily globally, that through having democratic methods of conflict resolution at the international level, that would ensure that conflicts would not spill over into violence. This has worked pretty well, by the way. I mean, Yugoslavia, which is not a part of the area that I'm talking about, of course, is the exception. And of course, there is conflict all the time. Conflict is normal. There's nothing unusual in conflict. On the contrary, a society which is without conflict is either deeply stagnant or has probably given up, or maybe it's the peace of the cemetery. There is no conflict because the human beings have given up. So I'm saying don't be in any way worried about conflict. Conflict is normal. It's how you resolve it is the big issue. And if you take that particular proposition, then you see a long-term process in Europe, the process of European integration, that the 6 founding members created a way of living together. One key element of this, one tends to be neglected these days, but I think is still there, well, a matter of principle, is the parity of esteem of each and every member state. Yes, large member states are more powerful. What they have to say is more important, but basically the idea that there is a certain shared respect as among member states is, I think, one of the fundamental elements of the European integration process. All this means is that over the years, so we're talking, let's say, 1957 with the Rome Treaty, but you can find some other starting date, 51, Coal and Steel Community. Over the years, a great deal of power has accumulated in Brussels, in the Brussels in which I'm sitting at this particular moment. So I'm using Brussels actually in the symbolic sense as the locus of this power. Much of this power is perfectly respectable and proper and reasonable and indeed even rational in its own terms. For example, this is the example I always give my Hungarian audiences. Hungary is downriver of each and every one of its neighbors with the exception of Serbia. So if there is water pollution upriver, we get it. And indeed, in the year 2000, we did get it. Some cyanide leaked into the headwaters of the river Tisa, and it killed all the fish in a very short space of time. That was before the Romanians and ourselves were members of the European Union. Since then, environmental regulation ensures that this doesn't happen. Above all, it means that issues of this kind can be resolved at the EU level, and the regulation which Brussels has issued, and I think there are about 220,000 pages of the acquis communautaire. I'm maybe out of date, ensure that a great deal of potential conflict has a regulation by which to ensure that it doesn't become particularly envenomed. The problem with this accumulated power is how do you deal with it in democratic terms? There are a number of fundamental problems. Let me take you back to the year 2007. At the end of the Portuguese presidency, the then Prime Minister of Portugal, José Sócrates, came up with a sentence which I absolutely loved. Democracy is Europe's DNA. Wonderful, I thought. I was so envious that I hadn't thought of it myself. So we have a commitment on the part of the European Union to be democratic, but can you have a democracy without a demos? And it's perfectly clear that there is no demos, no European demos. So this is where the problems begin with the accumulated power. How is it accountable? Transparent, well, up to a point it is. There's no perfection in transparency. Vitally, yet another element of the theory of democracy, feedback. How do you ensure that the wishes of the ruled, the demos, feed back into the power relationship with Brussels? And the answer is badly, the consequence of which is, well, you can see, rising political movements which question the legitimacy of the European integration process. They may not be Eurosceptic, they may necessarily they may say, well, we want another kind of Europe, one that is more accountable. Now, one further point I want to make. When the European integration process begins, it's pretty technocratic. It doesn't have too much political content. It has some, because all exercise of power has some political content. But what I want to suggest is that in the last 20 years, basically as a result of, well, after and as a result of the collapse of communism, something happens in European politics, and this is the rise of the liberal hegemony, both of social liberalism and economic liberalism. The European Commission, to some extent all the institutions of the European Union, have very largely accepted this as the norm. And they basically run their business on the fundamental assumptions of economic and social liberalism. Now let me turn to the other part of Europe, the one from which I come, and use these models of conflict resolution and trauma and asymmetric power, which I apply to the western part of the continent. And you will see that there are really a number of major and significant differences between Central Europe, Southeastern Europe on the one hand, and Western Europe on the other. The one that is blindingly obvious to me, but is very seldom put this way, is that all the major West European states, including some of the smaller ones, have been imperial states. We, in our part of Europe, have been part of somebody or other's empire. We in Hungary have had the pleasure, if you like, of being a member of part of three empires: the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian Empire, and indeed the Soviet Empire. Now, nobody recognizes Central Europe, Southeastern Europe as being post-colonial, but in a way we are. It does mean that our attitude to the rest of the world, including to Western Europe, is different. We are sensitive when it comes to our own power. One of the abiding experiences of Central and Southeastern Europe is lack of agency at the individual level, but above all at the collective level. Other people make our history, if you want to use this term. Or history is an external malign force over which we have no control. You find this in all the literature, and the reality is Poland has been partitioned 4 times. I think for anybody, background in Czechoslovakia, Munich was a traumatizing experience. For Hungarians, it's Trianon. And then the coming of Soviet power, over which this region really had no control at all. Agendas were imposed on the region. So I don't want to, and I suppose I really have to mention the terror and the perpetuation of the terror through secret police surveillance. It really was a very different experience. So when this region, 1989, gets rid of communism, I don't want to go into the argument of whether this is a domestic process or an international process. It's a combination of the two, I think. Necessary conditions and sufficient conditions. When communism disappears, the question then is, well, what? Where do we go from here? And the answer is self-evident. We want to return to Europe. What kind of Europe is there to return to is not determined by the Central and Southeast Europeans. It's determined by the existing beneficiaries, if you like, of the integration process. We are expected to conform, to accept the acquis communautaire, because it's to our benefit. And I'm prepared to accept that much of this has actually been benign. The problem is that our sense of agency, our sense of who we are and what we want to achieve, has been increasingly marginalized. Crucially, if Western Europe had its traumas answered by the integration process, the integration process has not answered the traumas of Central and Southeastern Europe. Far from it. In fact, if anything, it's not that difficult to paint Brussels, the symbolic Brussels with its accumulation of power, into the role of a hegemon, which doesn't allow countries of the region to take their decisions in the way that they would like to take their decisions. And the underlying social and economic liberalism is presented as a there is no alternative. This is what Mrs. Thatcher used to say, Tina, there is no alternative. That this is the only way of being European. And this, I think, is creating conflict. Above all, because in addition to conflict resolution, which I've been arguing is the core business of European integration, to some degree it's being replaced by human rights. Human rights is a universal principle. It's very hard to know where it begins and where it ends. What is a human right? What is not a human right? And what is the relationship between human rights and human dignity? For those of you who come from an Anglo-Saxon background, of course, human dignity means absolutely nothing. It's not a part of the I suppose, the intellectual equipment. But have a look at the Charter of Fundamental Rights, have a look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Human dignity is there, right at the outset. It's a key concept. If you don't pay attention to it, then of course things get envenomed, which I think is what is happening, because the liberal project that was foisted, I think that's not too strong a word, on Central and Eastern Europe, has actually not brought with it the results that people expected. We don't have the parity of esteem, the equality of status, and crucially, I can still remember this in Hungary in the early 90s, and I don't think Hungary was unique, the great aspiration was to catch up. Well, if you look at the figures, we've all improved, greater or lesser extent, domestic GDP per capita, but not one former communist country has caught up. The order of GDP per capita is pretty much today, is pretty much what it was in 2004 when we joined Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, later the European Union. Within the countries themselves, the ranking order within the countries, that's changed a little bit. In 2004 or 2002, I think is the figure from, Slovenia and the Czech Republic had a higher GDP per capita than Portugal or Greece. Greece has probably sunk down. It's a disaster and terrible story, but not one of them. None of us has reached Austria, for example, which in many ways has many similarities with Central Europe. Indeed, in 1938, what is now the Czech Republic, so Bohemia and Moravia, had a higher GDP per capita than Austria. By 1968, those figures were reversed. That's to do with, of course, communism as a disastrous economic system. So if you look at it this way, then it's reasonable to argue that there's been a disappointment. What has the European Union done for us? Well, it's done a great deal, but it hasn't actually answered what I see as the two key issues. In other words, the parity of esteem and the catching up, the economic equivalence of reaching West European standards. We haven't got there. And then what is happening? Well, the single market is working very well, you might say, the consequence of which is that there's a continuous labour migration from the countries of Central and Southeastern Europe to the West. Brexit comes into this. What happens to the million Poles and about another 500,000 Central and Southeast Europeans, not just Hungarians, but Czechs, Slovaks, Balts, large growing number of Romanians, about 200,000 Bulgarians. What happens to them? Well, we don't know. That what is interesting here is that nobody really accepts the argument that Is this the best way of using Central European labour when much of the best of the labour force finds jobs outside the country from which it comes? Sometimes, not infrequently, they're finding jobs in, let's say, London or Brussels or wherever, way below their qualifications. I've talked to hotel porters with university degrees, Hungarians, and I think, well, is this really the answer to somebody with a university degree, that they won't earn so much money as a hotel porter? Well, I do have serious doubts about this. So if you put all these together, and then maybe above all, what I'm going to call the narrative of democratic backsliding. Now, this has come up repeatedly in the context of Hungary, in the context of, we've forgotten this now, it was a long time ago, Lithuania, way back, Poland, of course, it'll come up. And strange to say, the practices in Central Europe, which may be open to question, are always regarded as more dubious than equivalent practices in Western Europe. There is a double standard being operated here. The consequence of which is there is a growing sense in Central Europe, Central and Southeastern Europe, that we are a part of Europe differently from Western Europe, given our historical experiences. This difference is not recognized, and that generates a variety of responses, one of which I think is resentment, or even, if you want, ressentiment. A deep sense of our status, our dignity is not regarded as equal. So this is a conflict which is going to go on, and what saddens me is that I don't see the methods of conflict resolution. Above all, and this is my final point, conflict resolution is about compromise. Human rights doesn't answer this, because human rights is a moral declaration claiming absolute validity. You can't compromise an absolute. So thank you for your attention. Enjoy the rest of your time in Bruges.